Have you ever wondered what it feels like when the person who brought you into this world decides you are no longer worth keeping? Have you ever imagined the crushing weight of being told that you are less deserving than others in your own family? Today, I want to share with you a story that will resonate with anyone who has ever felt abandoned, rejected, or cast aside by those who were supposed to love them unconditionally. This is a story about Sarah, a remarkable woman from Portland, Oregon, whose journey from abandonment to triumph will remind you that sometimes our greatest strength comes from our deepest wounds. Sarah's story begins like many others, in a small apartment in downtown Portland where her mother, Rebecca, was just 22 years old when she gave birth. Rebecca had always been honest about Sarah's father, how he was never really in the picture, how he made it clear from the very beginning that he never wanted children. When Rebecca discovered she was pregnant after only dating this man for a few months, she offered him what she thought was a kind gesture, the opportunity to walk away without any strings attached. He took that opportunity immediately, disappearing from their lives before Sarah even took her first breath. Rebecca would later tell Sarah that because of the bitterness and pain of that relationship ending, she had made the conscious choice not to pursue child support, convincing herself that it was better for everyone involved if they never had contact again. For the first 8 years of Sarah's life, it was just the two of them, against the world. Rebecca worked multiple jobs, sometimes cleaning office buildings at night after working at a local diner during the day. Sarah would often fall asleep to the sound of her mother's exhausted footsteps coming through the door at midnight, sometimes too tired to even say goodnight. But despite the struggles, despite the financial stress that seemed to follow them everywhere, there was a bond between mother and daughter that felt unbreakable. Sarah remembers those early years with a mixture of warmth and sadness, knowing now what she didn't understand then, that those were probably the last years she would ever truly feel wanted in her own family. Everything began to change when Rebecca met Marcus through her work at a small tech startup in downtown Portland. Sarah was 8 years old when Marcus first started coming around, and she remembers him as a tall, quiet man with kind eyes who always brought her small gifts, coloring books, or packets of stickers that made her feel special. Marcus worked as a software engineer, and compared to the struggles Rebecca had faced as a single mother, his steady income and reliable presence must have felt like a blessing. For over 3 years, Sarah watched her mother slowly transform from someone who was constantly worried about money and exhausted from working multiple jobs to someone who smiled more often and seemed to breathe a little easier. Sarah got along well enough with Marcus during those years. They weren't particularly close, but there was a comfortable coexistence in their home. Marcus would help Sarah with her math homework when Rebecca was working late, and he never made her feel like she was in the way or unwanted. Looking back now, Sarah realizes that Marcus was probably doing his best to be a good stepfather figure. But she also understands that his heart was never fully invested in being her dad the way it would be for his biological children. When Rebecca and Marcus got married, Sarah was 11 years old, and she felt hopeful that this meant their little family was finally complete, finally stable in a way it had never been before. The real shift began when Rebecca announced her pregnancy 4 years into the marriage. Sarah was 15 at the time, old enough to understand what this meant, but young enough to still hope that a new baby would only add to their family's happiness, not subtract from her place in it. She remembers the excitement in the house, the way Marcus would put his hand on Rebecca's growing belly and smile with a kind of joy that Sarah had never seen directed toward her. She remembers helping to paint the nursery, picking out tiny clothes, and genuinely feeling excited about becoming a big sister. In her teenage heart, she believed that her mother's love was infinite, that there would always be room for her no matter how many new people joined their family. What Sarah didn't anticipate was how dramatically everything would change once the twins, Emma and Jake, were born. Suddenly, the house that had felt like home became a place where Sarah felt like an unwelcome guest. Rebecca, who had once made time for Sarah's school events and teenage dramas, now seemed to only have eyes for the babies. Marcus, who had been politely friendly before, now seemed to view every minute of attention given to Sarah as time stolen from his biological children. The atmosphere in the house became tense and uncomfortable. with whispered conversations that stopped when Sarah entered the room, and a general sense that she was somehow in the way of this new family's happiness. Sarah tried her best to be helpful during those early months after the twins were born. She would wake up in the middle of the night when the babies were crying and try to help with feeding and changing diapers. She offered to babysit when her mother needed to rest, and she even took on more household chores without being asked, hoping that by making herself useful, she could secure her place in this new family dynamic. Instead of appreciation, her efforts seemed to be met with irritation, as if her very presence was a reminder of Rebecca's past that she would rather forget. The more Sarah tried to help, the more she felt pushed away until she started spending most of her time in her room, trying to stay out of everyone's way. The conversation that would change everything happened on a quiet Tuesday evening in March, 6 months after the twins were born. Sarah was 18 by then, having just celebrated a birthday that felt more like a formality than a celebration, with a small cake from the grocery store and a $20 bill from Marcus that felt more like a polite dismissal than a gift. Rebecca and Marcus asked her to sit down in the living room for what they called a serious family discussion. Sarah's stomach immediately started churning because she could sense from their formal tone that this wasn't going to be good news. She perched on the edge of the couch, looking at two people who were supposed to be her family but who suddenly felt like strangers delivering bad news. Rebecca started the conversation by explaining how difficult it had become to manage a household with 2 infants and how expensive everything had become with the new additions to the family. She spoke about sleepless nights and mounting bills, about the cost of diapers and formula and doctor visits, and how they needed to make some tough decisions about their living situation. Sarah listened with growing dread, knowing instinctively where this conversation was heading but hoping desperately that she was wrong. Marcus chimed in with statistics about the average cost of raising children and how their current income, even with both parents working, was stretched beyond its limits with 4 people to support. Then came the words that would echo in Sarah's mind for years to come. Rebecca looked at her daughter, the child she had raised alone for 8 years. The teenager who had helped paint the nursery and change diapers and tried so hard to be part of this new family, and told her that they couldn't keep supporting her anymore. They couldn't legally force her to leave since she was still 17, Rebecca explained, but they were hoping she would understand their position and make the decision to move out on her own. They needed to save their money and resources for the children who needed it most, Rebecca said. And by children, it was clear she meant the twins, not Sarah. The moment that broke Sarah's heart completely came when Rebecca tried to soften the blow by explaining their reasoning. She said that the twins deserved to stay with them more than Sarah did, not that they needed it more, but that they deserved it more. Those words hit Sarah like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of her lungs and making her understand with crystal clarity that in her mother's eyes, she had become less worthy of love and support than these new children. It wasn't about money as they had tried to claim. It was about preference. About Rebecca's choice to prioritize her new family over the daughter who had been by her side through the hardest years of her life. Sarah sat in stunned silence for several minutes, trying to process what she had just heard. Part of her wanted to fight, to argue that she had been there first, that she had helped Rebecca through difficult times, that she deserved consideration and love simply by virtue of being her daughter. But another part of her, the part that had been growing stronger over the past months of feeling unwelcome, recognized that there was no point in arguing with people who had already made up their minds that she was expendable. The dignity that Rebecca and Marcus thought they could manipulate by not technically evicting her was exactly what gave Sarah the strength to stand up and tell them that she would leave. That night, Sarah packed her belongings into 2 suitcases and a few boxes, taking only what she could carry and leaving behind the childhood bedroom that no longer felt like home. She called her maternal grandparents, Eleanor and Frank, who lived across town in a modest house near the waterfront. Even though they were in their 70s and dealing with their own health issues, they welcomed Sarah without question, their faces full of sadness and anger when she explained what had happened. Eleanor held her granddaughter that night as Sarah cried tears that felt like they would never stop, mourning not just the loss of her living situation but the death of her belief that her mother's love was unconditional. Living with her grandparents brought its own challenges. Eleanor and Frank were loving and supportive, but they were also elderly and on a fixed income. Sarah knew that her presence in their home was adding financial strain, even though they would never admit it or make her feel unwelcome. At 18, she immediately started looking for work, taking a part-time job at a local coffee shop near Portland State University. The work was physically demanding and the pay was minimal, but it gave Sarah a sense of independence and the ability to contribute to her grandparents' household expenses. She would wake up at 5 in the morning to open the coffee shop, work until mid-afternoon, and then come home to help her grandmother with household chores and her grandfather with his physical therapy exercises. Most painful part of living with her grandparents wasn't the financial stress or the early morning work shifts. It was the occasional visits from Rebecca and Marcus with the twins. Eleanor and Frank loved all their grandchildren equally and wanted to maintain a relationship with Emma and Jake, which Sarah understood and respected even though it meant having to see her mother and stepfather regularly. These visits were awkward and painful, with Rebecca and Marcus acting polite but distant towards Sarah, as if she were a neighbour's child rather than family. They would coo over how much the twins had grown and share stories about their latest milestones, but they rarely asked Sarah about her work or her plans for the future, treating her presence in the room as an inconvenience to be tolerated rather than welcomed. What hurt most was seeing how happy Rebecca seemed without her. The stress lines around her mother's eyes had disappeared and she laughed more freely when she was playing with the twins than Sarah could ever remember her laughing when it was just the two of them. It was as if Rebecca had been waiting her entire adult life to have children she actually wanted to raise, and Sarah had been nothing more than practice for the real thing. During these visits, Sarah would often excuse herself to her room or offer to run errands, unable to watch this happy family scene that so clearly had no place for her in it. The college application process was something Sarah had to navigate entirely on her own. Rebecca and Marcus had made it clear that they wouldn't be contributing financially to her education, having decided to save all their resources for Emma and Jake's future educational needs. Sarah's guidance counselor at high school helped her apply for financial aid and scholarships, but it wasn't enough to cover the full cost of tuition and living expenses. When it came time to find someone to co-sign her student loans, her uncle David, Eleanor's son, stepped in to help after making Sarah promise that she understood the responsibility and would never put him at financial risk by defaulting on her payments. College became both an escape and a challenge for Sarah. She chose to attend Portland State University partly because it allowed her to stay close to her grandparents, who were becoming increasingly frail, and partly because the in-state tuition was more affordable than other options. She worked multiple jobs throughout college, cleaning office buildings on weekends, tutoring younger students in the writing centre, and working as a server at a restaurant near campus. Her social life was limited because most of her free time was spent either working or studying, but she found solace in her classes, particularly in business and communications, subjects that felt like they were preparing her for a future where she could build her own stability rather than depending on anyone else. The years between 18 and 25 were a blur of work and school and more work. Sarah graduated with a business degree and immediately found a position at a mid-sized marketing firm downtown. The starting salary wasn't much, but it was enough to rent a small studio apartment and begin the slow process of paying down her student loans. She maintained regular contact with her grandparents, visiting them every Sunday for dinner and helping them with errands and medical appointments as their health continued to decline. These Sunday dinners became the highlight of her week, the one place where she felt truly welcomed and valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. Rebecca and Marcus would occasionally appear at these family dinners, usually on holidays or special occasions, but the interactions remained strained and superficial. Sarah would update them politely about her job and her life, and they would nod and make appropriate responses, but there was no real warmth or interest in these conversations. Emma and Jake, now energetic toddlers, were polite to Sarah but clearly saw her as more of a distant relative than a sister. Sarah watched them grow up from the periphery, buying them Christmas and birthday gifts that they accepted with the polite indifference of children who had been taught to be courteous to family acquaintances. As the years passed, Sarah threw herself into her work with a determination that impressed her colleagues and supervisors. She was often the first person in the office and the last to leave, taking on additional projects and responsibilities that others avoided. This work ethic, born partly from necessity and partly from a deep need to prove her worth, began to pay off in promotions and salary increases. By the time she was 28, she had been promoted to a senior account manager position. By 30, she was leading her own team and managing some of the firm's largest clients. By 35, she had been offered a vice president position at the company, making her one of the youngest executives in the firm's history. The promotion to vice president came with a significant salary increase and stock options that made Sarah's financial situation more secure than she had ever imagined possible. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't worried about making rent or paying off debt. She bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood near the river, furnished it carefully with pieces she had saved for and chosen specifically for their comfort and beauty. She created a home that felt peaceful and welcoming, a sanctuary where she could finally rest without worrying about being unwanted or unwelcome. The guest room that she decorated with care remained empty most of the time, but it represented something important to Sarah, the idea that her home would always have space for people she loved. Sarah's success didn't happen in a vacuum. She had worked incredibly hard, often sacrificing social relationships and personal time to advance in her career. But she had also been fortunate to work for a company that recognized and rewarded dedication and talent. Her colleagues respected her for her strategic thinking and her ability to manage difficult clients with grace and professionalism. Her supervisors appreciated her willingness to take on challenging projects and her track record of delivering results that exceeded expectations. The promotion to vice president felt like validation, not just of her professional abilities, but of her worth as a person who deserved good things. The one person Sarah had maintained close contact with throughout her rise in the corporate world was her uncle David, the man who had co-signed her student loans all those years ago. David had become something of a mentor and father figure to Sarah, celebrating her successes and offering advice during difficult times. When Sarah received her promotion, she called David immediately to share the news, wanting to thank him for the risk he had taken in helping her pay for college. David was genuinely proud of his niece's accomplishments and wanted to share the good news with the rest of the family, including Rebecca and Marcus, whom he occasionally saw at family gatherings that Sarah typically avoided. What Sarah didn't know was that Rebecca and Marcus had been struggling financially for several years. Marcus had left his stable job at the tech startup to start his own consulting business, which had initially shown promise, but had failed to generate consistent income. Rebecca had returned to work part-time as the twins got older, but the combined income from Marcus's struggling business and Rebecca's part-time job wasn't enough to maintain the lifestyle they had grown accustomed to during the years when Marcus had a steady salary. They had accumulated credit card debt and were behind on their mortgage payments, stress that was putting strain on their marriage and affecting their ability to plan for Emma and Jake's future educational expenses. When David mentioned Sarah's promotion at a family barbecue, describing how proud he was of his niece's success and how she had become one of the youngest vice presidents in her company's history, Rebecca's reaction was not the pride or happiness that David had expected. Instead, Rebecca seemed almost angry that Sarah had achieved such success without including her mother in her life or her accomplishments. Marcus was equally surprised to learn about Sarah's professional advancement, having assumed that she was still struggling financially in an entry-level position. The conversation planted a seed in their minds that would eventually grow into a plan that would bring them back into Sarah's life in the most unwelcome way possible. Several weeks after learning about Sarah's success, Rebecca and Marcus showed up unannounced at her front door on a Saturday morning. Sarah was in her garden wearing old jeans and a t-shirt, enjoying one of the few weekend mornings she had free from work commitments. When she invited Rebecca, there was an Sarah. When Rebecca, instead of she said the act Marcus, but they both she talked. The irony of this narrative was lost on neither Sarah nor, she suspected, on Rebecca herself, though neither of them acknowledged it directly. Then came the ask that Sarah had been dreading since the moment she saw them at her door. Rebecca explained that Emma and Jake were now approaching college age and that despite their best efforts, she and Marcus hadn't been able to save enough money for their children's education. They had heard about Sarah's success and wondered if she would be willing to help with college expenses, framing it as an opportunity for Sarah to give back to the family that had supported her during her own childhood. The audacity of this request took Sarah's breath away, but what came next was even worse. When Sarah didn't immediately agree to their proposal, Rebecca's tone shifted from polite request to emotional manipulation. She reminded Sarah of all the years she had raised her as a single mother, of all the sacrifices she had made to provide for her daughter during those early years. She suggested that Sarah's current success was built on the foundation of love and support that Rebecca had provided, conveniently forgetting the years of abandonment and rejection that had followed. She painted Sarah's reluctance to help as ingratitude and selfishness, suggesting that this was Sarah's chance to repay her mother for everything she had done for her. Marcus joined in with his own version of emotional blackmail, pointing out that Emma and Jake were Sarah's half-siblings and that family should help family in times of need. He made it sound as if Sarah's refusal to pay for their college education would be a betrayal of family values and a demonstration of the kind of selfishness that put personal success above family loyalty. The entire conversation was carefully orchestrated to make Sarah feel guilty for having succeeded and selfish for wanting to keep the fruits of her own labor rather than giving them to the people who had abandoned her when she needed them most. Sarah listened to this manipulation with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The people who had told her she was less deserving than their biological children were now asking her to prove her worth by paying for those same children's education. The mother who had kicked her out at 18 because she wanted to save her resources for the children who deserved it more, was now expecting Sarah to provide those very resources she had been deemed unworthy of. The hypocrisy was so blatant that Sarah almost laughed, but the situation was too painful and too personal for humor. When Sarah finally responded, her voice was calm but firm. She told Rebecca and Marcus that she would not be paying for Emma and Jake's college education, and that she found their request both inappropriate and hurtful given their history. She reminded them that they had made it clear years ago that they wanted to save their money and resources for their biological children, and that they were now free to use those saved resources for exactly the purpose they had intended. She pointed out that she had received no help with her own education and had worked multiple jobs throughout college to pay her own way, and that she saw no reason why Emma and Jake couldn't do the same if their parents couldn't afford to support them. The reaction to Sarah's refusal was immediate and ugly. Rebecca became defensive and accusatory, claiming that Sarah was being vindictive and holding grudges from the past instead of focusing on what was best for the family as a whole. She accused Sarah of being selfish and materialistic, suggesting that her success had made her forget where she came from and who had helped her get there. Marcus joined in by pointing out that Sarah's refusal would have real consequences for Emma and Jake's futures, as if their educational prospects were somehow Sarah's responsibility rather than their parents'. The argument that followed was years in the making, with Sarah finally having the opportunity to voice the hurt and anger she had carried since she was 18 years old. She told Rebecca and Marcus exactly what their abandonment had felt like, how it had shaped her understanding of her own worth, and how she had built her success despite their lack of support rather than because of it. She reminded them that she had been the one supporting herself since she was barely an adult, that she had worked while her classmates partied, and that she had built her career through her own determination and hard work. Rebecca's response revealed the depth of her selfishness and her inability to acknowledge the pain she had caused her daughter. Instead of apologizing or showing any understanding of Sarah's perspective, she doubled down on her position that Sarah owed the family financial support. She accused Sarah of being unforgiving and suggested that her success had made her arrogant and uncaring. She even had the audacity to suggest that Sarah's refusal to help was evidence that she had turned out badly despite Rebecca's efforts to raise her well, as if abandoning your child at 18 was somehow good parenting. The confrontation ended with Sarah asking Rebecca and Marcus to leave her house and not to contact her again unless they were prepared to offer a genuine apology for their past behavior. She told them that she would not be manipulated into feeling guilty for their financial problems or their poor planning, and that she would not be providing financial support to people who had made it clear that she was unwanted in their family. The visit had lasted less than 2 hours, but it felt like a lifetime of pain and resentment had been compressed into that brief toxic encounter. In the days following their visit, Rebecca began a campaign of harassment that started with emails and text messages designed to make Sarah feel guilty and selfish. The messages alternated between attempts at emotional manipulation, reminders of Sarah's childhood dependence on her mother, and accusations of ingratitude and family betrayal. When Sarah stopped responding to these messages, Rebecca escalated to creating new email accounts and phone numbers to continue her harassment, showing a level of persistence that bordered on obsessive. The breaking point came when Rebecca showed up at Sarah's workplace, demanding to speak with her, and causing a scene in the reception area when Sarah refused to see her. The incident was embarrassing and potentially damaging to Sarah's professional reputation, and she realized that her mother's behavior was escalating beyond emotional manipulation into actual harassment that could affect her career and her safety. That evening, Sarah contacted a lawyer to discuss her options for legal protection against Rebecca's increasingly erratic behavior. The lawyer recommended filing for a restraining order, especially after Sarah described the escalating pattern of harassment and the workplace incident. The legal process was straightforward but emotionally draining, requiring Sarah to document years of emotional abuse and abandonment for the court record, writing out the timeline of her relationship with her mother, from the abandonment at 18 to the recent demands for financial support, helped Sarah see the pattern of manipulation and abuse that had characterized their relationship for years. The situation reached its climax when Rebecca showed up at Sarah's house one evening, having apparently been drinking and becoming increasingly agitated when Sarah refused to open the door. When Sarah threatened to call the police, Rebecca's behavior became physical, with her pounding on the doors and windows and screaming accusations and threats that the neighbors could hear clearly. Sarah did call the police that night, and Rebecca was arrested for harassment and trespassing, spending the night in jail and facing charges that would likely result in a criminal record. The arrests seemed to be a wake-up call for Marcus, who contacted Sarah the next day to apologize for Rebecca's behavior and to assure her that he would seek help for his wife's mental health issues. He admitted that Rebecca had become increasingly unstable over the past few months, not just with Sarah but in other areas of her life as well, and that he was concerned about the impact her behavior was having on Emma and Jake. He told Sarah that he was taking the twins to stay with his parents while Rebecca received professional help, and that he hoped Sarah would be able to forgive them eventually, though he understood that the damage might be irreparable. The restraining order was approved without any objection from Rebecca, who seemed to understand finally that her behavior had crossed legal boundaries and that continuing to harass Sarah would only make her situation worse. Sarah learned through David that Rebecca had been hospitalized briefly for what the family described as a nervous breakdown, though Sarah suspected that the breakdown had more to do with facing the consequences of her actions than with any genuine mental health crisis. Either way, Sarah felt relieved to have legal protection against further harassment and to know that Rebecca was finally getting some kind of professional intervention. In the months following these events, Sarah focused on rebuilding her sense of peace and safety in her own life. She changed her phone number and email address, installed a security system at her house, and took some time off work to recover from the emotional trauma of the confrontation and its aftermath. She also began seeing a therapist to work through the complex feelings of grief, anger, and relief that she was experiencing as she processed the final end of her relationship with her mother. The therapy process was both painful and healing, helping Sarah understand that her mother's abandonment was never about Sarah's worth or lovability, but about Rebecca's own limitations and selfishness. Working with a professional helped Sarah develop strategies for dealing with the guilt and sadness that sometimes overwhelmed her when she thought about her fractured family relationships. It also helped her appreciate the strength and resilience she had developed through years of taking care of herself and building a successful life despite her challenging family history. Eleanor and Frank, now in their 80s, remained constant sources of love and support throughout this difficult period. Sarah made sure to spend even more time with them, knowing that their health was declining and that her relationship with them was one of the few positive family connections she had left. They were proud of how Sarah had handled the situation with Rebecca and impressed by her success and independence, though they were also sad that their family had become so fractured by Rebecca's choices and behavior. Sarah settled into her new reality, free from the harassment and manipulation that had characterized her relationship with her mother for so many years. She began to appreciate the peace and stability she had created for herself. Her work continued to thrive with new opportunities and responsibilities that challenged and fulfilled her in ways that felt meaningful and rewarding. Her home became a sanctuary where she could rest and recharge, surrounded by things she loved, and free from the anxiety of unexpected visits or demands from people who saw her only as a source of financial support. The experience of setting boundaries with Rebecca and following through with legal action when those boundaries were violated taught Sarah important lessons about self-respect and self-protection. For years, she had felt guilty about her success and happiness, as if she didn't deserve good things after being rejected by her own mother. The confrontation and its aftermath helped her understand that she had not only deserved the success she had achieved, but that she also deserved to protect and enjoy that success without interference from people who wanted to exploit her generosity and guilt. The months that followed the restraining order were a time of deep reflection and healing for Sarah. She began to understand patterns in her relationships that had been shaped by her early experiences of abandonment and rejection. In therapy, she discovered that she had unconsciously been seeking approval from colleagues and friends in ways that sometimes compromised her own needs and boundaries. The little girl who had been told she was less deserving had grown into a woman who worked twice as hard as necessary to prove her worth, who gave more in relationships than she received, and who struggled to believe that she was lovable simply for who she was rather than what she could accomplish or provide. Working through these realizations was both painful and liberating. Sarah began to see how her mother's abandonment had affected not just her family relationships, but her romantic relationships as well. She had dated men who were emotionally unavailable, unconsciously recreating the dynamic of trying to earn love from someone who was incapable of giving it fully. She had ended relationships that had potential because she couldn't believe that someone would want to be with her without some ulterior motive. The pattern was so ingrained that it took months of therapy to begin recognizing and changing these destructive habits. A particularly powerful therapy session involved Sarah writing a letter to her 18-year-old self, the frightened young woman who had packed her belongings into suitcases and left the only home she had ever known. In the letter, Sarah told her younger self that everything was going to be okay, that the rejection she was experiencing was not a reflection of her worth, and that the strength she was developing by surviving this abandonment would serve her well in the years to come. She told her younger self about the house by the river, about the successful career, about the friends who would become chosen family, and most importantly, about the peace and self-respect that would eventually replace the pain and confusion she was feeling. Writing that letter made Sarah realize how far she had come, not just professionally and financially, but emotionally and spiritually as well. The scared teenager who had been told she didn't deserve her family's resources had become a confident woman who understood her own value and refused to accept less than she deserved from others. The young woman who had worked multiple jobs to pay for college had developed a work ethic and sense of self-reliance that served her well in every area of her life. The daughter who had been abandoned had learned to create her own sense of belonging and family among people who truly appreciated her presence in their lives. Another significant breakthrough in Sarah's healing process came when she realized that she didn't need Rebecca's apology or acknowledgement to move forward with her life. For years, she had harbored a secret hope that her mother would eventually recognize the pain she had caused and take responsibility for her actions. She had imagined scenarios where Rebecca would beg for forgiveness and they would rebuild their relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine love. The confrontation and its aftermath made it clear that Rebecca was incapable of the self-reflection and accountability that would be necessary for such a reconciliation. And Sarah finally accepted that her healing didn't depend on her mother's participation or approval. This acceptance was both heartbreaking and freeing. Sarah grieved the mother she had always wanted but never had. The relationship that could have been if Rebecca had been capable of unconditional love and emotional maturity. But she also felt liberated from the burden of hoping for something that was never going to happen. She could finally invest her emotional energy in relationships that were reciprocal and healthy, rather than continuing to hope for love from someone who had proven repeatedly that she was incapable of providing it. The relationship with Eleanor and Frank became even more precious during this period of healing and growth. Sarah spent every weekend with her grandparents, helping with household tasks and medical appointments, but also simply enjoying their company and the unconditional love they provided. Eleanor had become increasingly frail, requiring assistance with cooking and cleaning, while Frank's memory was beginning to show signs of decline. Sarah treasured these times with them, knowing that they represented the last remaining connection to positive family relationships from her childhood. During one of their Sunday dinners, Eleanor shared stories about Rebecca's childhood that helped Sarah understand some of the factors that had shaped her mother's capacity for relationships. Eleanor described a little girl who had always been selfish and demanding, who had struggled to share attention or resources with others, and who had shown early signs of the narcissistic behavior that would later characterize her parenting. While this information didn't excuse Rebecca's treatment of Sarah, it helped Sarah understand that her mother's limitations were long-standing personality traits rather than reactions to anything Sarah had done or failed to do. Frank, despite his declining memory, often expressed pride in Sarah's accomplishments and concern about the way Rebecca had treated her. In his more lucid moments, he would tell Sarah how proud he was of the woman she had become and how sorry he was that his daughter had been incapable of appreciating the gift she had been given in Sarah. These conversations were deeply moving for Sarah, who felt seen and valued by her grandfather in ways that her mother had never been able to provide. Frank's validation meant more to her than any professional accolade because it came from someone who had known her since childhood and who loved her unconditionally. As Sarah's healing progressed, she began to open herself up to the possibility of romantic relationships that were based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than the patterns of seeking approval and earning love that had characterized her previous relationships. She started dating James, a fellow executive at a different company whom she met at a professional networking event. What initially attracted Sarah to James was his emotional maturity and his ability to communicate openly about his thoughts and feelings, qualities that were completely different from the emotionally unavailable men she had typically been drawn to in the past. The relationship with James developed slowly and carefully, with both of them being intentional about building trust and intimacy gradually. James had his own history of family challenges, having grown up with an alcoholic father and a mother who had struggled with depression. So he understood the complexities of healing from childhood trauma while building adult relationships. Their conversations about family and healing were some of the most honest and vulnerable exchanges Sarah had ever experienced with a romantic partner, and she began to understand what it felt like to be truly known and accepted by someone who wasn't trying to fix her or change her, but simply wanted to understand and support her. The professional satisfaction Sarah derived from her work also deepened during this period of personal growth. Her role as vice president involved mentoring younger employees, and she found great fulfillment in helping others navigate their careers and develop their professional skills. Many of the young women she mentored reminded her of her younger self, hardworking and ambitious but sometimes lacking confidence or support system. Sarah made it a priority to provide the kind of encouragement and practical assistance that she had wished for during her own early career, becoming the kind of mentor and advocate that she had needed but hadn't had access to. One particularly meaningful mentoring relationship developed with Amanda, a young marketing coordinator who had grown up in foster care and was putting herself through school while working full-time. Amanda's background resonated deeply with Sarah, who saw in her the determination and resilience that had characterized her own journey from abandonment to success. Sarah, Sarah's now in there, when they, Sarah, the few, they had, despite the league, the crim, however, throughout, in front, the year, they moved, both of, the pregnancy and early months of motherhood were transformative for Sarah in ways she hadn't anticipated. Holding her daughter for the first time, she was overwhelmed by a love that was immediate and unconditional, completely different from the earned and conditional affection that had characterized her relationship with her own mother. As she cared for her baby, feeding her and comforting her and simply enjoying her presence, Sarah began to understand for the first time how unnatural and wrong her mother's behavior had been. No loving parent could look at their child and decide that they were less deserving of care and support than other children, and Sarah realized that Rebecca's capacity for this kind of rejection revealed a fundamental lack of normal parental instincts and emotions. Becoming a mother also deepened Sarah's appreciation for her grandparents, who had provided the kind of unconditional love and support that had probably saved her life during her most vulnerable years. Eleanor and Frank, now in their late 80s and dealing with serious health issues, were overjoyed to meet their great-granddaughter and spent their remaining energy creating memories and connections with the newest member of the family. The photographs from this period show 4 generations of love and connection, with Eleanor holding her great-granddaughter, while Frank looks on with pride and joy, and Sarah beaming with the happiness of someone who has finally created the kind of family she had always dreamed of. Eleanor passed away when Sarah's daughter was 18 months old, dying peacefully in her sleep after a gradual decline in health that had allowed for long goodbyes and final expressions of love. The funeral was attended by dozens of people whose lives Eleanor had touched through her kindness and generosity. But it was also complicated by Rebecca's presence and her attempts to position herself as the primary grieving daughter despite years of strained relationships and minimal contact with her mother. Sarah found herself in the surreal position of protecting her infant daughter from the grandmother who had abandoned her, while grieving the loss of the grandmother who had saved her. Frank's decline was more gradual and more heartbreaking, with periods of lucidity mixed with increasing confusion and memory loss. During his clearer moments, he would tell Sarah repeatedly how proud he was of the life she had built, and how sorry he was that his daughter had been incapable of loving her properly. He would hold his great-granddaughter and talk about how beautiful she was and how lucky she was to have Sarah as her mother, creating a bridge between the past and the future that acknowledged both the pain of what had been lost and the hope of what was being created. Frank died when Sarah's daughter was 3 years old, leaving Sarah with a profound sense of loss, but also with the knowledge that she had been deeply loved and valued by people who truly mattered. The inheritance from her grandparents was substantial, including the house where Sarah had lived during her late teens and early adulthood, along with savings and investments that reflected a lifetime of careful financial planning. More importantly, though, Eleanor and Frank had left Sarah with a legacy of unconditional love and acceptance that provided a foundation for the family she was creating with James and their children. The values they had modelled of treating people with kindness and respect regardless of their circumstances, of working hard and taking care of those you love, of finding joy in simple pleasures and maintaining dignity even in difficult situations, became the guiding principles for Sarah's own approach to parenting and family life. As Sarah's daughter grew from toddler to preschooler to school-aged child, Sarah marveled at the ease and naturalness of loving her unconditionally. There was never a moment when she questioned whether her daughter deserved her care and attention, never a calculation about whether resources spent on her daughter could be better used elsewhere, never a comparison that found her daughter lacking in some way that would justify withdrawal of love and support. The idea of telling her daughter that she was less deserving than some other child was so foreign to Sarah's understanding of maternal love that it reinforced her conviction that Rebecca's behavior had been fundamentally abnormal and wrong. Parenting also gave Sarah a new appreciation for the resilience and strength she had developed through her difficult childhood experiences. When her daughter faced challenges at school or in friendships, Sarah was able to draw on her own experiences of overcoming adversity to provide guidance and support that was both practical and deeply empathetic. She could teach her daughter about the importance of self-reliance while also providing the kind of unconditional support that would allow her to take healthy risks and recover from failures. The balance between independence and support that Sarah had learned to create for herself became the foundation for the kind of mother she wanted to be. The professional recognition that came with Sarah's continued success in her career was deeply satisfying, but it paled in comparison to the fulfillment she found in creating the kind of family that had been denied to her during her own childhood. When she was promoted to senior vice president and then to the executive committee of her company, the achievements felt meaningful, primarily because they provided the financial security and flexibility that allowed her to be the kind of parent and partner she wanted to be. Success was no longer about proving her worth to people who had rejected her, but about building the kind of life that reflected her values and priorities. The few times that Sarah heard news about Rebecca through mutual acquaintances or family members, the updates reinforced her decision to maintain no contact. Rebecca's marriage to Marcus had ended in divorce after his business failed completely and they lost their house to foreclosure. Emma and Jake had struggled to finance their own education and had both dropped out of college, lacking the work ethic and determination that had carried Sarah through her own educational challenges. Rebecca herself had moved in with relatives and was working in retail, a dramatic contrast to the comfortable lifestyle she had enjoyed during her marriage to Marcus. While Sarah felt no satisfaction in Rebecca's struggles, she also felt no obligation to provide assistance or intervention. The woman who had told her 18-year-old daughter that other children deserved support more than she did would have to live with the consequences of alienating the one person in her family who had achieved the kind of success that might have allowed her to help during difficult times. Sarah's decision to maintain no contact was not based on vindictiveness, but on self-protection and the recognition that Rebecca had never shown any genuine remorse or understanding of the pain she had caused. The example that Sarah set for her own daughter became the most powerful validation of her choices and her values. When her daughter was old enough to ask about her maternal grandmother and why they didn't have contact with that side of the family, Sarah explained in age-appropriate terms that sometimes people make choices that hurt others, and that protecting your family sometimes means limiting contact with people who aren't capable of treating everyone with kindness and respect. She told her daughter about Eleanor and Frank, the great-grandparents who had provided love and wisdom during difficult times, and about the importance of surrounding yourself with people who value and support you rather than tear you down. As Sarah's daughter grew older, she began to understand that her mother's strength and resilience had been forged through difficult experiences, and she developed a deep appreciation for the stability and love that characterized their family life. The confidence and security that Sarah provided for her daughter was built on the foundation of everything Sarah had learned about what children need and deserve from their parents. The home they created together was a sanctuary where mistakes were learning opportunities rather than sources of shame, where individual achievements were celebrated without comparison to others, and where love was never conditional on performance or behavior. The relationship between Sarah and James continued to deepen over the years, strengthened by their shared commitment to creating the kind of family that neither of them had experienced during their own childhoods. They supported each other through the challenges of parenting, career pressures, and the ongoing process of healing from their respective family traumas. Their partnership was based on mutual respect and genuine affection, providing both of them with the kind of stable, supportive relationship that served as a model for their children and a source of strength during difficult times. Looking back on her journey from abandoned teenager to successful executive and devoted mother, Sarah often marveled at the ways in which her most painful experiences had contributed to her greatest strengths. The abandonment that had felt like the end of her world had actually been the beginning of her real life, forcing her to develop the independence and resilience that had served her so well in every area of her life. The rejection that had made her question her worth had ultimately taught her to create her own sense of value, based on her character and achievements rather than on other people's opinions and approval. The family she created with James and their children became the ultimate proof that love and belonging are choices that can be made and remade throughout our lives, rather than accidents of birth that we have no control over. The home they built together was filled with the kind of laughter and warmth and unconditional acceptance that Sarah had always dreamed of, but had never experienced during her own childhood. The security and happiness that characterized their family life was a daily reminder that the pain and rejection of the past had not defined her capacity for love and belonging in the present and future. Sarah's story serves as a powerful reminder that the families we create can be more loving and supportive than the families we were born into. That success built on our own efforts is more satisfying than success handed to us by others. And that the strength we develop through overcoming adversity becomes a gift that we can share with others who are facing their own challenges. Her journey from abandoned daughter to devoted mother demonstrates that our past does not have to determine our future, and that the love we give and receive as adults can heal the wounds left by the love we were denied as children. Today, Sarah lives in a beautiful home, filled with the sounds of family life, the chaos and joy of children growing up, surrounded by love and support and endless possibilities. The scared 18-year-old who packed her belongings into suitcases and left the only home she had ever known could never have imagined the rich and fulfilling life that awaited her. Built on the foundation of her own strength and determination, and the love she found from people who truly valued her presence in their lives. Her story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of choosing love over resentment, hope over despair, and healing over hatred. Sarah's story is ultimately one of triumph over abandonment, of success built on the foundation of self-reliance and determination rather than family support. It's a reminder that the people who are supposed to love us unconditionally sometimes fail us in the most painful ways, but that we have the power to create our own families, our own definitions of success, and our own sense of worth that doesn't depend on the approval or acceptance of those who have hurt us. Sarah's journey from rejected teenager to successful executive is proof that sometimes the greatest gift our families can give us is the motivation to prove them wrong about our worth and our potential. Lessons from Sarah's experience resonate with anyone who has ever felt abandoned or rejected by family members who were supposed to protect and support them. Her story reminds us that emotional manipulation often masquerades as family loyalty. That people who abandon us during our times of need have no right to our resources during their times of need. And that setting boundaries with toxic family members is not selfish but necessary for our own well-being and success. Most importantly, Sarah's story demonstrates that we are not defined by how our families treat us, but by how we choose to treat ourselves and others as we build our own lives and create our own definitions of home and belonging. Today, Sarah continues to thrive in her career and her personal life, surrounded by friends and colleagues who value her for who she is, rather than what she can provide. She has learned that the family we choose is often more loving and supportive than the family we're born into, and that success is sweetest when it's built on our own terms, rather than on the approval of people who have proven themselves unworthy of our trust and affection. Her house by the river remains a sanctuary, but now it's also a symbol of everything she has accomplished through her own strength and determination. A testament to the remarkable resilience of the human spirit when it refuses to be defined by rejection and chooses instead to create its own path to happiness and fulfillment. If you recognize yourself in Sarah's story, if you've ever felt abandoned by people who were supposed to love you, or if you're struggling to build your own sense of worth after being rejected by family members, remember that Sarah's journey is proof that you deserve better, that you are capable of creating the life and the family and the success that you dream of, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who refuse to see your value, and instead surround yourself with those who celebrate your worth and support your dreams.